You're talking to a room which has three lawyers facing me. There are three members of the inquiry staff, one of whom is Mary, who will ask you to take the oath in a moment or two. And then we have Shumik, whose job it is to make sure that when documents are referred to, you see them on your screen until they're taken down and you see Ms. Scott again. Ms. Scott will be asking you the questions.
I see.
Beyond the inquiry room, there will be somewhere in the region of 200 people watching on either YouTube or Zoom, and they will hear what you have to say as if they were here, which, because of current restrictions, plainly they cannot be. So that's the scene. Ms. Scott now has the questions for you.
Mrs. Hithersay wanted to be sworn in first.
First of all, you'll be sworn.
Okay.
Please state your full name.
Medora Ann Hithersay.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Mrs. Hithersay, can you see and hear me?
Anne?
Thank you. So you took up your role as administrator for the Mcfarland Trust in September 1987, is that right?
That is right, yes.
And at some point over your tenure there, the title of your role changed from administrator to chief executive. But is it right in understanding that your job remained the same, although the title had changed?
Yes, my job remained the same.
And when you arrived at the Mcfarland Trust, you were told that part of your role was also to act as the secretary for the Eileen Trust. Is it right that you hadn't known about that until you took up your position?
That is correct.
And you were taking over from Wing Commander John Williams, who had been both the administrator for the Mcfarland Trust and the secretary for the Eileen Trust, since both of those organisations had started. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
And the chair of both the Mcfarland Trust and the Eileen Trust trustees was the Reverend Alan Tanner.
Yes.
And is it right that he remained the chair of both boards of those trusts until he was replaced by Peter Stevens in March 2000?
That's right, yes.
And you continued as chief executive of the Mcfarland Trust and secretary of the Eileen Trust until your retirement in October 2003. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And your role, both in the Mcfarland Trust and the Eileen Trust, was taken over by Martin Harvey in October 2003.
That is right, yes.
And in that same month, October 2003, you became a trustee of the Haemophilia Society, and you remained a trustee of the Haemophilia Society until December 2010, when you stood down and you didn't seek reappointment. Is that also correct?
It is not quite correct, because having seen the papers and been reminded of the becoming a trustee of the Society, I see that in fact I attended an extraordinary meeting of the board in September 2003. And that was not in my statement because it is not what I recalled.
And you're there talking about the Haemophilia Society, yes?
I am talking about the Haemophilia Society.
So at the point that you became, I'll refer to you as the chief executive of the Mcfarland Trust and the Eileen Trust, your statement tells us that you had experience in the charitable sector, having been employed both as a regional director for the charity Scope, and also having been a director of the St Christopher Fellowship, and in that latter role, you'd been responsible for managing children's homes and special needs housing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that you had also taken and obtained a master's degree in business administration.
Yes, that's correct.
And so was your role at the Mcfarland and the Eileen Trust, was that a move sideways, or was it a career progression from the roles that you'd undertaken previously?
I don't think I really considered at the time. I left St Christopher's Fellowship and obviously looked for more employment, saw the advertisement, or the post was actually advertised as director of the Mcfarland Trust, and it didn't include anything about the Eileen Trust in the advertisement.
How would you describe the responsibilities and duties of your role, of your roles within the Mcfarland and Eileen Trust as the chief executive or director?
I was responsible to the Board of Trustees and for the management of the staff team and for ensuring that the aims and objectives contained in the Mcfarland Trust, Eileen Trust, trustees, trust deeds were carried out as far as I was able, in accordance with the direction and guidance of the trustees.
So is this right? Were decisions made by the board that you, as chief executive, had to implement with your staff team?
That's right. There were some decisions which were delegated to the staff team.
And we'll, as we go on through the morning, we'll look at in a little bit more detail at some of those. Did you also have a role as chief executive in advising the board on policy, on strategy, and on the decisions that they were required to make?
I certainly advised them of what the staff and I myself gleaned, picked up, if you like, from our information, our communication with the registrants of both trusts.
So part of your role was liaising with the registrants and feeding that into the board?
Yes.
But in terms of policy and strategy and decision making that sat with the board, given your experience in the charitable sector, and given that the trustees were unpaid volunteers, is it not right to understand that the chief executive did have an advisory role, advise the board about strategy and policy and so on?
I certainly think that with the original chair and vice chairman of the Mcfarland Trust, there wouldn't have been any question of my attempting to advise them on policy and strategy matters. I hope that when the next chairman took over, we probably had more dialogue, but again, he had a very clear idea about the role. So I don't think my advising on strategy and policy was common. There was, of course, dialogue in the trustee board and with the registrants, but I didn't see that as a prime part of my role, no.
And the chair and the deputy chair, the Reverend Alan Tanner and Mr. Grinstead was the deputy chair, was he?
That's right,
At the
yes.
you said there was no question of you providing that kind of advisory role. Why was that?
I think it was because they didn't feel they needed it. They were both very clear in what they understood to be the aims and objectives of the Trust, and regarded me and the staff team as there to implement those objectives.
You've described in your statement that when you arrived at the Mcfarland and the Eileen Trust, you knew very little about haemophilia, HIV or contaminated blood. And so it was a steep learning curve. How did you go about educating yourself in those matters?
In those days, there wasn't much of an internet, so one couldn't Google anything. So you had to find papers, and obviously, having done an MBA, I was familiar with research. And I read and I talked to people. Some of the staff team had been there a while, and they understood far more than I, and were very able to fill me in. And in particular, meeting and talking with registrants. And that was a steep learning curve.
You've described in your witness statement as well that the board of trustees when you first arrived were and this is the way you put it, mainly ex-military post-World War II veterans, financial men who were very guarded with the fund. Is that right? Is that was your impression of the board of trustees?
My recollection, yes.
And how would you describe their understanding of and relationship with the beneficiary population and the challenges that they faced?
Well, the trustee board, as I think I've stated a number of times, was made up of people with haemophilia, or members of the Haemophilia Society who had a great in-depth knowledge of haemophilia. There was nobody on the board with HIV. Alan Tanner had, of course, lost his son to HIV and haemophilia. I'm never sure quite what Clifford Grinstead's relationship with the haemophilia and HIV aspect. I think he was brought in, to the best of my knowledge, he was invited in by Alan Tanner, who knew that he had a great in-depth knowledge of managing money. The other trustees were either, in the case of one of the appointments by the Department of Health, Mark Winter, who was a centre director and knew all about haemophilia, and the other appointment from the DOH side related to that was a haemophilia nurse from one of the haemophilia centres. I forget which one. There would have been two other Department of Health appointments, and I can't remember their names at the moment. The other trustees would have all been members of the Haemophilia Society and would have been very familiar with both haemophilia from either their own experience or their children's experience, and with HIV.
And you've also said in your statement that your recollection was that the trustees would rather money was gaining interest in the bank account rather than providing that money to families in need. Why do you think that was?
I think that certainly the trustee board felt that it was their responsibility to look after and grow the amount of money that had been transferred to set up the trust in 1988. And I think they felt that at that stage there were regular payments being paid, albeit very modest, to the registrants, and there was a schedule of the kind of grants with guidance as to how much was paid for each grant area, and that they should stick strictly to those guidelines, not move beyond them, and not be over generous. That was the taste that I got.
And was your approach different?
Yes, I think it was.
And did you have any allies in the board? Was there anyone sympathetic to your approach on the board in the early years?
Well, certainly Chris Hodgson, who was the chairman of the Haemophilia Society as well at that time, he was very sympathetic. He obviously knew a lot of people through the society and through his own personal contacts, through schools. And he was very well aware of the extent of need. He knew many families, particularly who had been, if you like, youngsters with him when he was a young boy with haemophilia. He is the one who stands out. I am sure there were others.
And did the difference in approach that you've described make for a difficult relationship with the board?
No, not difficult. I think they were surprised that my approach was that we should look more closely at the needs of the registrants and perhaps move away from or not be so rigid with the guidelines that were produced for grant making.
And we'll come on and look at the guidelines and so on in a little bit more detail later on this morning. You describe in your statement that you were given information by Wing Commander Williams and the Reverend Tanner when you first started at the Mcfarland and Eileen Trust about how the Mcfarland Trust had been set up. Can you recall what was said to you about that?
Well, I was told that it had been set up by government in order to recognise the impact that had been had on the lives of the children and mostly young people who had been treated with the cryoprecipitate, the factor 8, and that this had been introduced to ease the risk of great bleeds with disability, and that the fund was to be used to make up for the deficit in their lives caused by the treatment and the infection with HIV.
And were you told anything at that stage about the HIV litigation and the settlement agreement and indeed the waiver that the registrants had signed in order to receive money from Department of Health?
I almost certainly was told it. I don't think it had much of an impact at that early stage. I think all I was aware of at that stage was that there was money in a fund to be administered by the Trust for the benefit of all the registrants.
And were you aware from the beginning, from when you first started, that most, if not all, of the registrants were co-infected with hepatitis C?
No.
Can you recall when you did become aware of that?
I joined in 97. I would have said by 99, certainly 1989, 1998, 99. It was becoming more of a feature, recognised in the Haemophilia Society and in the Mcfarland Trust. When I first was told about hepatitis C, it was explained to me that it had not been regarded as a significant issue at the time because HIV was so much more serious and was likely to probably mean that most of the registrants would die before hepatitis C became an issue. And of course it wasn't known as hepatitis C then. It was known as non-A, non-B virus.
You also make mention in your witness statement about there being a cut-off date for the Mcfarland Trust of 2012. What were you told about that and by whom?
I cannot clearly recall when that became an issue. Certainly I was not told that at the beginning when I joined. I think I expected that it would go on for the natural life of the registrants. I think it became clear to me over time, but I can't say exactly when. It would probably have been 1998 or possibly early 99. Certainly by the time that we started to carry out the strategic review, there was a growing awareness of it.
And was that something that was discussed much during your tenure, either at board level or with the Department of Health? Or was it something that was quietly shelved? The 2012 cut-off date.
When after the strategic review, that's was the first of our reviews. I think by then we did realise that there was a likely termination date, and I understood that to be 2012. And at that stage, it became clear that after 1997, when the introduction of combination therapies had occurred, that the life expectancy of the registrants was very uncertain, but likely to be longer and that it was no longer a terminal illness. So we were aware that there would be a continuing need for support from the fund for a good long time to come.
And so, is it right to understand that the information about the 2012 cut-off date was information that came from within the Mcfarland Trust itself, rather than from the Department of Health, for example?
I never recall the Department of Health mentioning that date.
So it was an understanding that you picked up with discussions with those within the Mcfarland Trust that there was an end date, but by the time of the strategic review, when it became clear that that would be inappropriate, is it right to understand that was quietly shelved?
I don't think it was ever shelved at all. I think there was a growing awareness that the Trust would need to continue, and at that stage I think we started to advise the Department of Health that the needs were changing for the registrants, and that the support from the Mcfarland Trust was likely to go on for longer than had first been envisaged.
You've mentioned the advent of new treatments, triple therapy, and increased life expectancy for those suffering from infected with HIV. Was there a feeling when you started at the Mcfarland and Eileen Trust that this was there was a significant change that the Trust needed to be aware of and take into account?
Definitely, yes.
I'm just going to take you to a document to get an idea of the numbers of registrants. Can we go to SHMAC MACF 605_041? Now this is one document. The inquiry has received this document in this form. It's not these minutes I want to take you to, but just to talk you through the document. So there's Trustee Minutes from 10th of February 1998, and then if we go through to page 7 of the document, which is the first document that comes after the Trustee Minutes. There's an administrator's report, which goes over to page 8, and then the document I want to take you to is page 9. You will see there that it's a document entitled Statistics Summary at 30th of April 1998. I'm unclear why that's part of the same document from a February minutes, meeting minutes, but there we go. So just before we look at the detail on this document, were these documents generated by you or by your staff for board meetings?
These would have been prepared by the staff team. By April 1998, I believe we had a finance officer in post. In fact, I'm virtually certain we do, and it would have been his responsibility to prepare these in discussion with the staff.
And they would have been provided to trustees for board meetings, would they?
Probably not every board meeting. Certainly regularly they would have been provided.
So looking then at the top half of the page, we can see that we've got numbers of registrants, both living and deceased. So
Yes.
it looks like by the 30th of April, there were 480 living registrants. Are we to understand that 480 number are those people with haemophilia infected with HIV by contaminated blood?
That is certainly my understanding of that figure, yes.
And 759 had already died, which meant that there were within that cohort 1,239 registrants registered with the Mcfarland Trust.
Yes.
And then looking down below at E, we've got partners with HIV 31. So those are sometimes we see in documents those that cohort of registrant identified as infected intimates.
Yes.
And 22
Well, I think
had
you'd have
already
to
died.
include the widows with HIV for that as well, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Partners and widows.
Yes, partners and widows. We've got 31 partners, 21 widows still alive, infected intimates. And then 338 widows alive, 19 had already died. Well, in fact, 338 plus 135 widows still alive. 24,
They were widows with
yes,
dependent children.
widows with dependent children. 24 widows had died, 5 of whom had dependent children. And so...
Can you just help with this? Widows either have or haven't dependent children. Where the class is set out at F of widows, is that widows without dependent children, or is it all widows?
I'm afraid I can't answer from this distance of time.
Thank you.
And equally, the same might be said of H. Does widows encompass widows with dependent children and widows with HIV? Do you know the answer to that?
No, I don't think it does. No, the widows with HIV. Some of them probably also had children. In fact, I know they did. I'm sorry, but this is a record that I inherited from the original days of the Trust, and I don't think I ever actually questioned that presentation.
So the number at F, widows, may be a total number of widows, but it may not.
Gosh, I'm sorry. I'm afraid at this distance of time I cannot answer that.
You can take that down. I'm going to ask you some questions now about the staff team, and I'll do that by reference to a document. That's MACF 40/176_009. This is the Mft Handbook. Can you just tell us what the Mft Handbook was and who saw it?
Well, the handbook was for the registrants and for our guidance in the office. And obviously the trustees were, they encouraged the distribution of it.
And was
Again, this is something that I inherited. It was something that had been done since the foundation of the trust.
and was it something that was printed every year, or a new one done every year?
I can't recall at this distance. It was certainly something that was always made available to the registrants.
Certainly we've got, during your tenure, one from 98, 99, 2000. I don't think we've got 2001 and 2002. Could that be because there wasn't one in 2001 and 2002?
I wish I could answer that question, but I can't.
Shumit, can we go to page 19 of that document? We'll look at various different parts of this document. I just want to start at page 19. So that's where it sets out who the trustees were, and over the page at page 20 it sets out the staff team. So you can see a picture of you and 1997, which indicates you started in 1997, and we can see there that Claudette Allen was the social worker, and she, is it right to understand she would have started in 2000?
That's right, yes.
And she replaced, did she, Fran Dix,
She did.
who was the previous social worker who started at around about the same time as you in September, October 97.
Yes, that's right.
We can see.
Six.
Sorry?
Six started in October 97. There was a previous social worker whose name escapes me at this moment.
Is it Mr. Tudor Williams?
Yes, that's right.
And we see what Claudette sets out what her role was at the Trust. Claudette is our social worker and is responsible for all types of help and advice to registrants. She can answer queries about trust payments and provide advice and help about most aspects of living with HIV. She's in regular contact with haemophilia centres in the Society, and she can contact local authorities and other bodies on your behalf. And we can also see there Carol, I understand that's Carol Clisby, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And she was the Mcfarland Trust Benefits Advisor who began in 2001.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
And did she take over from Jenny Jackson, who was the previous Benefits Advisor?
Yes, she did. There may have been a slight gap.
And we see there that she deals with queries about social security benefits, can sort out problems with the DWP and help with appeals against unsatisfactory decisions and attend appeal hearings if necessary. She also, if we turn over the page to page 22, there's some pages entitled Welfare Benefits. Would Carol Clisby have been responsible for drafting this sort of information for the handbook and indeed for newsletters and so on?
Yes, she would, and Jenny before her.
Thank you. And then if we can go back to page 20. And then we can see the rest of the staff team. We've got Rodney Shepherd, I believe, who is a finance officer, Ros
Yes.
Riley, administrative secretary, and
Yeah.
Lisa, I'm afraid I don't know Lisa's second name, finance assistant. So that was the staff team in 2003.
Yes, it was.
And the size of the team, it was broadly consistent, was it, during your tenure?
When I first arrived, there was Jenny Jackson as benefits advisor. There was Tudor Williams as social worker. There was Funmi Hassan, who did all the administrative work, and there was John Williams. Pretty soon after I joined, I felt we needed more robust financial support in the office, and the deputy chairman agreed, and so the finance officer post was created.
And in addition to these staff, so employees, is it right that Susan Daniels was also providing independent financial advice to registrants, or financial advice to registrants?
Yes, I'm not quite sure when that arose. I mean, Susan was available to registrants about the time that I joined, and maybe for longer. I'm not sure when her help was introduced, but it was certainly at that first stage she ran her own private business providing advice. Later she joined a company providing advice on financial matters and investment.
And Susan Daniels is due to give evidence to the inquiry, so we can no doubt ask her those questions. Shumet, can we go to page 7, please, of this document? Page 8 of this document. So here we've got the section financial help from the trust, and this is the section that sets out the different payments that can be obtained from the trust. So we can see, so if we go over onto page, the following page, so we can see here the regular payments, winter payments, and then if we go over the page, single payments. So those were those the 3 types of payments made by the trust during your time there?
Yes, they were. The additions obviously were related to housing and debt, which would have depended on Susan's recommendations to us, and quite a lot to do with loans and equity loans, etc. But I'm sure we'll come on to that later.
We'll come on to that. But the payments or the grants or the payments that would have been made to registrants to discharge debt, or in relation to housing, leaving to one side the equity share loans, would either have been single payments, would they, or potentially loans?
Yes. Yes.
They were. That wasn't a category of grant in its own right.
It wouldn't have fallen within the normal grant guidelines.
I understand.
These were discretionary payments, and depending on their size and their need, it could have been a direct grant. More often, when it related to housing debt, it probably would have been some kind of loan, either secured by a charge on the house or an equity loan agreement, which I think is something that had been started fairly early on in the life of the trust. Well,
we'll certainly come back both to the issues you raised there, the payments, the discretionary payments outside the guidelines, and the
Yes.
loans.
Yes.
So if I can start then on looking at regular payments, Shumet, can we go back to the page before? So we look at regular payments, and it sets out there a substantial increase in regular payment from September 2000, and I'll ask you some questions about that in due course, but and then saying that there's a further review is going to be undertaken, unlikely to be lead to major revisions. Who can have a regular payment? Everyone is registered, is eligible for a monthly payment at some rate. Just ask. Is it right to understand that talking there about those that are registered, meaning what we sometimes see referred to as primary beneficiaries, i.e. those
Yes.
people with haemophilia infected with HIV.
Yes, regular payments were also paid to widows and to infected intimates
Yes.
at different rates.
Yes, and we'll come on and look at that.
Yes.
And it says there, just ask. So is it also right to understand that in order to get a regular payment, you needed to make an application for one?
No, because at the outset of the trust, regular payments were part of the package of benefits to the registrants, and we had a complete list of registrants. Later, there would have been circumstances which changed. For example, when we became aware of infected intimates, or indeed of children born with HIV, and so there would have been increases. Those would have been advised to us mainly by the haemophilia centres, who would have advised that there was someone else who should rightly expect to receive a regular payment.
So was it the case during your time there that everybody who was registered with the Mcfarland Trust received a regular payment?
Yes, I can't think of anybody who didn't, and any reason why they shouldn't have.
May I just ask, suppose the case of somebody who has HIV, who is a primary beneficiary, to use those terms, they have a family, they die. Because they had HIV and because of the care given to them by members of their family, the family suffers from greater hardship than they would have had if he had not had HIV. But he is no longer a registrant because he's dead.
Yes.
Potentially, you have a number of further registrants, do you? Because they are within the terms of the original trust deed. They are dependents and widows or spouses or partners.
There would have been payment to widows.
But not to the children. What if the person who dies is a single parent?
Sorry, you'll have to expand on that. You mean if there was, most of the people who died at that stage were men, fathers?
Yes, but they may have been responsible for children. Their wife may have died, assuming they've been married. Their wife may have died, or they were no longer living together in circumstances in which he would have the care of the children. That would leave the children. Would they, if they had been dependent, they would be within the terms of the trust? Would they be regarded as registrants or not?
Dependents. And in some cases, the dependents, if they had neither parent available, would have been looked after by grandparents.
Yes.
As I think we'll look at later, there was a case in the Eilidh Trust where there was nobody available except for a lady who took on the foster mothership of children after seeing their mother shortly before she died.
But so far as the children were concerned, they would be within the terms of the trust deed. Would they receive any regular payment or not?
I think the payment would have, if they were infected, and some of them were, then they would have their own payment, yes.
But
if they were not infected but dependent on the father as his dependent, then they would continue to be supported by the trust until they were 18. And if they went on to further education, they would be supported through that period of further education.
Now, did that support come in the form of, in part, at any rate, of regular payment or not?
It did, yes.
Thank you.
Can we, Shamik, go over to page 11 now? So these regular payments were paid monthly, is that right?
Yes.
And we set the regular payment monthly rates are set out on this page.
I'm going to have to reach for my specs. Oh no, that's better. I can read that.
So
Yes.
at A, we've got the standard rate available to all registrants is £255, and then depending on the makeup of the household, that might be increased for a partner or for a dependent child.
Yes.
And then we've got the higher rate available to those who claim who are in receipt of certain benefits, and that's at £305. And again, that's uplifted to take account of the makeup of the household. So is it right to understand that this system was designed to give higher monthly payments to those with the least income, and that was assessed by using the benefits as a proxy for working out who had the lowest income?
Yes, I'm not sure about the use of the word proxy, because our benefits advisor would have been very aware of the benefit status of anyone in need of being paid benefits, and she would have obviously advised the trustees of this situation. So it wouldn't have been ad hoc, as it were. It was just that if they were on one of those above qualifying benefits, there would have been an addition to what they received from the trust in regular payments.
Yes, but the point I want to establish with you is that there wasn't an additional assessment of the income and expenditure of the individual, of the registrant, by the Mcfarland Trust. You
Certainly not during my tenure.
for the regular payment, it was you got the higher rate if you were in receipt of certain benefits. So that's what I meant by proxy.
Yes, I see. Yes, okay.
So then coming down then to partner who is HIV positive.
Yes.
So it looks here as though the partner who's HIV positive gets the £255 standard rate. If in receipt of certain benefits, then another £61. Is that right?
Let me just catch up with that. Yes, I think so.
So that puts them on the same rate as that's effectively rate B, higher rate.
Exactly.
Is it right that was a change that took place during your tenure? That previously infected partners had received a lower rate than the the person with haemophilia who had been infected with HIV?
Yes, it was slightly lower. I think as a result, I'm not sure of the date of this particular piece of paper I'm looking at, but certainly at the time of the strategic review and the time of the review of regular payments, I think these things would have come to light and there would have been discussion at trustee board level. I cannot recall, I'm afraid, what changes took place and when.
Sorry, Ms. Hithersay, I think I've asked the question on the wrong premise. So can I just go back a question? I think I suggested to you that a partner who is HIV positive was receiving under this scheme the same rate as the person with haemophilia who is infected. And in fact, I don't think that's correct. So the person with haemophilia, is it right to read the scheme in this way? A person with haemophilia who is in receipt of income support, for example, will get the higher rate of £305. and if they also are in receipt of the higher or middle rate care component of the disability living allowance, they will get an additional £61. Is that what we understand from the
Yes,
from this
yes,
policy?
that is. Yes, yes, that
For
is what I
for that person's partner who is infected with HIV, so we're looking here at for partner who is
Yes.
HIV positive,
Yeah.
even
Yes.
if they receive the income, for example, income support,
Yes.
they will only receive the standard rate of £255. Although if they are also in receipt of the higher or middle rate care component of disability living allowance, they may also get the supplement of £61.
Best of my knowledge at this point in time, I would say yes, that seems logical, but I cannot state that as a certainty.
So, why was it? Assuming that what I've just put to you is correct, which I think you've accepted, it probably is. Why was it that an infected partner received less by way of regular payment than the person with haemophilia who was infected?
I can only say that I don't know for certain, but I would think it likely that because the situation of somebody with haemophilia who developed HIV meant that they already had the pre-existing condition of haemophilia and in many cases would have had disabilities relating to that.
So you don't know for certain, but what you're describing is effectively a policy decision on the part of the Mcfarland Trust that the person with haemophilia should get more than the infected partner.
I think it is possible to look at it that way. I think when the trust was first set up, it was very clearly seen that the group that would become registrants were all people with haemophilia. And at that stage, it was not anticipated, or probably not really cognized, that in fact many of the partners and widows, wives of those who had become infected would also have become co-infected. I don't think that when the regular payments were first set up, it had been anticipated that regular payments would later be paid to partners and children who subsequently became infected.
But we know, for example, that there was a review of the regular payments in 1999, because we just looked at that part of the handbook, and this discrepancy in the rate survived that review. So, I mean, it seems to suggest to you there are two explanations for why that could be. One is it's a policy decision on the part of the trustees that the person with haemophilia who is infected, it should get more, is deserving of more by way of regular payment than the infected partner who does not have haemophilia. So that could be the first explanation. The second is, and possibly related to it, there simply wasn't enough money to give both the same rate, and so a hard decision had to be made, and it was to give the partner a lower rate. Are you able to assist us?
I'm not sure that's a choice, actually, because the second is also a policy decision.
Yes.
Isn't it? So your first question, is it a policy decision or is it something else? Actually, you've answered it.
Yes.
Certainly during my tenure, there was never a policy decision to pay less money to infected intimates or children. It is my understanding that the situation developed over time, and that the trustees, before I joined certainly, that the trustees would have come to a decision that regular payments should be paid to anyone who was infected with HIV through blood products or through intimate relations with someone who was infected. At some point in time before I joined, there must have been a decision about how much should be paid. Now, I have no knowledge of how that decision was come about, or whether it was a policy decision as such. I don't think, from my tenure, that there would have been a question of one person being more deserving than another. I think they would have referred back to the trust deed, which was about people with haemophilia who had been treated with infected blood. I also don't think that there would have been any question of such a decision being influenced by perceived lack of money. Obviously, it would have been a situation which had to be considered early in the life of the trust, and I have no knowledge of how that decision was reached. But I don't think we should assume that it was dependent on a view that one person was more important than the other.
Would that policy, if that was a policy decision, would that be wrong in your view?
I think that's really a question ultimately for me, isn't it?
Yeah.
One can see that the scheme was not a scheme to compensate those who had got HIV. They had to have it through infected blood products. And that was the original scheme. So
yes.
It's those who are suffering from HIV as a result of having infected blood products, or the needy spouses, parents, children, other dependents of such persons. So it was envisaged, as I read the trust deed from the start, that those who were needy spouses, parents, children, and other dependents were within the class who would benefit from the discretion of the trustees. I can understand that there may have been an argument one way or the other about whether those with haemophilia actually had greater needs which needed to be satisfied on a regular basis because of the devastating effects of that condition, quite apart from HIV. But that's a decision ultimately for me
Yes.
to weigh, I think.
So Hithersay, can I put it a slightly different way? Do you have any recollection of there being different rates under the regular payment scheme during your tenure for those people with haemophilia who are infected with HIV and their partners infected with HIV? Do you recollect that as being an issue?
I don't recollect that as being an issue, no. Once somebody was infected with HIV, either through direct blood-related treatment or through intimate relations with that person, then once they were infected with HIV, they would have become a registrant of the trust. And they would have been eligible for regular payments. And without looking at the schedule going back, I cannot tell you whether the rates were exactly the same or not.
And so you would have expected, would you, that partners infected with HIV and people with haemophilia infected with HIV should be treated the same?
But they would all receive the standard rate unless there were additional reasons for supplements.
And so
That's my recollection.
And so to the extent that this policy that we looked at doesn't reflect that, can you help us as to how that policy could have come about?
As I think I've tried to explain, I think the policy is one of those many things that in the Mcfarland Trust grew like topsy. You know, it had started off with one understanding of the situation, and that situation had changed over time, and the trustee board at the time would have responded to how they perceived the need and how it should be responded to at the time.
So then can we go look then at the position for widows and dependents? So we see here for 6 months following bereavement, widows receive whatever rate had been paid to their partners, except for the supplement payment, and the supplement payment is the £61 that the person with haemophilia
Yes.
would have received if they had certain
Well, that was related to mobility,
Yeah.
yes.
And a transition payment is also available for those caring for orphans. So just pausing there, are we to understand that all widows were paid the same as their partners for 6 months, except for the supplement payment,
Yes.
no matter what the circumstances were?
That is my recollection.
It's your
They
recollection.
were also paid a bereavement grant.
And then there's reference there to a transition payment available for those caring for orphans. You were giving some evidence in relation to that earlier. Does that prompt your memory in any way? Do you recollect what a transition payment was?
No, I don't.
It gives the impression
But
that it's a payment that's not going to last for very long.
no, it did not. It did not last very long.
Then after 6 months, 6 months after the bereavement, widows whose circumstances are not described below will get paid a further £100 per month for a further 9 months.
Yes.
And so those widows not described below, is it right to understand that their support and funding would be cut off by the Mcfarland Trust 1 year and 3 months after the bereavement, no matter what their circumstances were?
That is my understanding of what was available at the time. However, I do know that what would not have been cut off from them would have been advice and support from the Trust in other ways, particularly the benefits advisor and the social worker, who would have helped them obtain extra income and support through statutory services.
Did that, so let's just look then at working out who this class of widows are. Widows who are themselves HIV positive will be paid without time limit at the appropriate rate for a registered person. So it seems from this that once the person with haemophilia has died, the widow is no longer classed as a partner who is HIV positive, but it actually becomes the registrant themselves and can claim either the standard rate A or higher rate B. Is that right?
That is correct.
So it doesn't include widows who are HIV positive. It seems to, and it doesn't include, it would seem, incapacitated widows or widows with children. Is that right? Their support continues.
Yes, that's right.
So that class of widow who gets cut off from financial support after 15 months are non-incapacitated widows without children.
Yes.
Did you consider that was appropriate as a policy for Mcfarland? Did you have any concerns about that category of widow being unable to claim, unable to receive money after 15 months?
I didn't question that. That was a situation that had been there when I joined, and it wasn't a decision that I questioned. However, what I did question was continuing level of other support to them and the importance of that. And I think that will become obvious later on in our discussion.
So were you not aware of great hardship from that cohort of widows who suffered as a result of this policy?
If and when we became aware of great suffering, we would try to help them in the way that I think I've just described, either through our benefits advisor helping them obtain more income in terms of grants from the state or increased payments from the state, or in providing them with support services. Later on, obviously, bereavement meetings and other meetings, which of course they were welcome to join. But no, I didn't ever question the trustee decision, which had been taken long before I joined, that after a period of time the widows without children would cease to continue to have support from the trust.
The inquiry heard yesterday from, well, over the last 2 days, from Peter Stevens, who was asked about support for dependents and widows, and the view that he gave was that it was inadequate. Would you agree with that? Did you think that the support that was given by Mcfarland was inadequate?
With hindsight, yes.
But at the time, you that didn't occur to you.
At the time, I didn't see any possibility of the funding situation being looked at. So therefore, the only avenue I could see at that time to assist them was to ensure that other areas of help from the trust remained open.
And you didn't see any possibility of the funding position being looked at by the Mcfarland trustees themselves, or are you talking there about the Department of Health providing more money to the Mcfarland Trust? Or both?
At the time, there were many things about the way the trust had been set up that I simply accepted. It was only over time that it became clearer that needs were changing and some needs were not being adequately met. Because there were very many needs in very many different areas, this is not one that I particularly looked at from recommending an increased, either in terms of time support or amount for widows who had died, who didn't have dependent children and were quite fit in themselves.
So is it right to put it like this, that at the time you didn't question this policy, but now looking at it with hindsight, you can see that the provision for widows and dependents was not adequate?
Well, you're asking now about two different areas, aren't you? You're talking about widows. I'm speaking about widows without children who were fit. And you're bringing in with dependent children. Now, as far as I'm concerned, payments for widowed mothers with dependent children would have depended upon the rates that we can see here, unless they were infected or unless their children were infected, in which case they would have been increased. Again, I think I was probably guided by past precedent. And it would be very easy to agree with Peter in saying that, of course, we didn't do enough. I mean, right through the way that we operated, perhaps lacked the generosity that we would now feel should be available. Hindsight is wonderful.
So looking at it with hindsight, which is what you're being asked to do, can I just understand your evidence in relation to widows without children, so that cohort that were after 15 months had no funding?
Yes.
Do you
Yes.
Are you saying that you agree with Mr. Stevens that support was inadequate?
I would agree with Peter that it was that the financial support, with hindsight, was inadequate.
The financial support.
I do know that we did try and encourage and help people to become better qualified, and that was nothing to do with a cut-off date related to their their payment support from the trust.
And then
We
in
continued to offer.
Sorry, do finish. Sorry.
We continued to offer help in other ways.
And then in
As
relation.
long as
Sorry.
as long as it was needed, as long as they kept coming back for it.
And then in relation to widows with dependents or incapacitated widows, so those are the cohorts of widows who's continue to receive financial assistance from the trust.
Yes.
We can see there that the rates are £100 if incapacitated per month, £100 for the first dependent children, and £30 thereafter for any further dependent children. So would you agree that the rates that are being offered to those cohorts of widows are lower by quite a substantial margin than the rates that the family would have received from the Mcfarland Trust during the lifetime of the primary beneficiary?
Yes.
And now, looking at it with hindsight, does that cause you any concern? And does that cause you to consider whether or not those payments were adequate?
Well, yes, of course it does.
And does it follow from that then that there were areas of unmet need within the widow and dependent community during the time that you were at Mcfarland?
Yes, it does.
And is it right to understand, or would you agree with the evidence that the inquiry heard from Mr. Stevens, that the reason for that was because the trust was inadequately funded by the Department of Health?
That is a very difficult area, because I found during my tenure that each time we went to the trust with recommendations for higher payments due to changing needs, that was not refused. So it would not be right to say that that was purely due to inadequate funding from the Department of Health. That it would be also accurate to say that we did not highlight that particular area of need to them and ask for substantially more money to support the widows without dependents, and, well, indeed, all the widows, except those who were infected with HIV. They all could have had greater support and didn't, and that was partly our lack of bringing that to the notice of the Department of Health.
So I note the time. I have got I've got a few more questions on the regular payments and questions on the other payments, but I could pick that up after the break.
Well, if it's convenient now, then we'll take a break. This is a break of about half an hour, so we'll come back at 11:45, Ms. Hithersay. And during that period, you will have heard me say, I think, on early occasions, if you've been watching, that you are giving evidence. The rule is that you must not discuss the evidence you have given or any of the evidence which you think you might yet have to give or be asked to give with anyone, whoever they are. You can talk about anything else you like. Look forward to seeing you back here at 11:45. Thank you very much.